At my installation of my ordination as a bishop at St. Patrick's in Melbourne, I refer to the Vietnamese Catholics as the new Irish in Australia. And there you have it. It's wonderful for us to be here. I think when we gather like this, we feel a sense of energy, enthusiasm, and the power of the Spirit in our shared mission. I believe that you have had a wonderful day yesterday with inspiring talks and the sharing sessions to follow too. And I hope that I'm not going to let down that high standard. Failing that, I trust that I am not giving you indigestion after a very good breakfast. And failing that still, I'll use one of Henry VIII's lines to his or one of his 8 wives. I won't keep you very long, dear. So, friends, I'd like to begin this reflection with a story of our indigenous people. And it goes like this. Once upon a time, perhaps in the dream time, there was a tribe that settled along a mighty river, like the Murray or the Darling River. It was teeming with all kinds of freshwater creatures that sustained people and provided much security and well-being for them. They lived happily, peacefully along its banks. But then one day, without warning, a big flood came, and it submerged and destroyed everything in its wake. The people evacuated to dry land, and when the flood had subsided, they returned and resettled where they used to. But then things were not the same anymore. The river flow became weaker and weaker, and people sat daily around its edge and wondered what had become of their once mighty and life-giving river. It was very sad and depressing until one of them decided to leave the billabong, to go upstream and explore. And that person returned later and told the rest of the tribe that their beloved river had not dried up at all. It had merely changed its course. In a way, I guess we Catholics today in Australia especially find ourselves in a place that are no longer familiar to ourselves, like those Aboriginal people who returned to their beloved river and realized it was not the same anymore after the big flood. We too are being confronted with the changing reality. A world that is increasingly alien to us, foreign to us. And I'd like to think of this critical juncture as analogous to the biblical exile, which I'm very fond of as a former exile refugee myself. The exile was about facing the death of the old and giving birth to the new. the old understanding of a tribal, vengeful, jealous deity who favored the chosen people over against the non-chosen peoples who dwelt in the temple, gave way to a much more expansive and universal notion of who God was and what it meant to be truly his people. In the exile, there occurred a paradigm shift, that fundamental change in the way people related to God, to others, and to that hostile and foreign world around them. They learned to live their faith anew without the familiar symbols of the past, like the temple, the priesthood, the festivals, the land, etc. The Catholic Church today, dear friends, is in crisis, especially the Catholic Church in this country. And I think that's stating the obvious. But crisis, is, as the former Master General of the Dominicans, Father Tim Ratcliffe, who is coming to Australia again very soon, said that crisis is the spécialité de la maison, that is, specialty of the house. Indeed, more often than not, it has been crisis and unrest that brought about moments of rebirth and renewal. Consistently, in salvation history, God has brought unexpected outcomes out of the most crushing defeats. Out of the ashes of the exile, for instance, he brought about the new Israel. Out of the ashes of the crucifixion, the resurrection. Out of the ashes of the Roman persecution, the truly universal church was born. So watershed moments can be catalysts for renewal and transformation. It's not something to be afraid of. And I believe that we are living in that privileged moment, that watershed moment in the history of the church in this country. Given the critical situation we face now and into the future, what do I hope for the church in Australia in 20, 30 years? Will the church in Australia be a real vibrant force in society, or will it be an irrelevant minority, relegated to a culturally insignificant ghetto? Will it be an isolated, murky billabong left behind after the Great Flood? Or will it change its course and chart a new, life-giving future in accordance with the direction of the kingdom? So I'd like to share with you some of my dreams for the church of the future in Australia. First is the church of humility and servanthood. The late Cardinal Carlo Martini, Jesuit, said in his last interview before his death in 2012, he said, "I dreamed about a church that went forward in poverty and humility, that did not depend on the powers of this world." The late Cardinal also said, famously or infamously, that the Catholic Church specifically, he said, is about 200 years behind the time. Perhaps it's a very Jesuit way of telling the power that be in Rome to get on with the job of implementing the prophetic vision of the poor, humble servant church that the council had envisaged. many decades earlier. I hold that it is necessary that we die to that which is unworthy of Christ and his gospel, so that a humble church, humbled yet purified, may emerge and shine forth more brightly as a beacon of hope for all. And aren't we being humbled? Perhaps humiliated is a better word. In my testimony at the Royal Commission, I maintain that we need to dismantle the pyramid model of church. And I hold that this model, which promotes the superiority, the elitism of the ordained, and the excessive emphasis on the role of the clergy at the expense of the ordained, the unwashed like you, is at the very root of the culture of clericalism that we have inherited. And I can't put it more strongly enough, but I really do believe that we need to dismantle it, because to dismantle this model is not necessarily to dismantle the church per se, or even to dismantle the hierarchy of which I'm a privileged member. Rather, it is to acknowledge and to have the courage to die to the old ways of being church that no longer convey the message of the gospel to the culture in which we live. And I wonder how many of you have ever heard of what is known as the Pact of the Catacombs. You have? Some of you have. That's more than 50 years ago. The Pact of the Catacombs was signed up by more than 40 bishops, mostly from Latin America. And they asked for the grace to be faithful to the Spirit of Jesus. The Spirit of Jesus, which they had seen manifested through the council, to lead a life of poverty and humility, and to be a poor servant church, which is, I think, the core legacy of the Second Vatican Council. Dom Helder Camara was the signatory to this pact, and so were many predecessors of Jorge Bergoglio, Pope Francis. By signing, they make a commitment to live in poverty, to reject all symbols and privileges of power, and to place the poor at the center of their pastoral ministry. You know, at the Royal Commission, I maintained that in order to dismantle the pyramid model of church and to confront clericalism, we need to look at things like honorific titles, privileges, institutional dynamics in the church that breed elitism. And I didn't think I was being too radical. Because more than 50 years ago, in the very Pact of the Catacombs, these things were mentioned. And I quote, "We will try to live according to the ordinary manner of our people in all that concerns housing, food, and means of transport and related matters. So when I queue up at the Tiger Airways counter, along with a whole host of very unwashed people, I endeavor to live that life according to the ordinary manner of our people. We renounce forever the appearance and the substance of wealth, especially in clothing and symbols made of precious metals. I don't suspect Cardinal Raymond Burke would like that point very much. We do not want to be addressed verbally or in writing with names and titles that express prominence and power. We seek collaborators in ministry so that we can be animators according to the Spirit rather than dominators according to the world. What a prophetic vision that is. What courage and passion for the gospel of Jesus. These men, in the spirit of the council, mapped out that path of renunciation and purification that would enable a poor, humble church to be born. It has been a rather painful birthing process, one must admit, since the heyday of the council. But those salient points that I highlighted remain to be lived and to be seen to be lived by many bishops, myself included. I may not be the Bishop of Blink or the lover of a Kappa Magna. However, the challenge of living a life of poverty and humility, of being a poor servant church, remains relevant today as it was then, all those 50-odd years ago. The second dream I have is the church that goes to the margins. And I'm aware that many of you sitting here are doing that very act of going to the margins, of being what I call the boundary riders. Pope Francis constantly calls us to move beyond the security of status quo and take the risk of going to the periphery. The church must be the church of the poor and for the poor. The church must go out of itself in order to be close to those in need. And if one can detect the direction of Pope Francis's pontificate, I think it has something to do with the movement from security to boldness, from inward looking to outward looking, from preoccupation with our status quo, safeguarding our privileges, to learning to be vulnerable, learning to convey God's compassion to those on the edges of society and church. Hence, our challenge is to accompany people from the margins into the journey towards the fullness of life and love. It is to embrace the call of the council, to identify with the joys and hopes, the griefs and anxieties of those who are poor or anyway afflicted. It is to be the bearer of joy to those who are most deprived of it. So he or she must be able to live and bridge that yawning gap, the liminal space between the ideal and the real. Pope Francis challenges us also to divest ourselves of clericalism and elitism and return to the purity of the gospel. His constant call to the church to be less concerned with itself and to be more outward-looking encourages us to walk with people in the ambiguities and complexities of their lives. The self-referential church, steeped in a culture of splendor is in stark contrast with the church of the poor and the church for the poor. It is the latter that we who pattern ourselves according to Jesus, the prophet on the margins, endeavor to serve. It is like the new wine in the new wineskins, the new wine of God's unconditional love, boundless mercy, radical inclusivity, and equality needs to be poured into the new wineskins, friends. New wineskins of humility, poverty, mutuality, compassion, and powerlessness. The old wineskins that pyramid model of church sustains, all wineskins of triumphalism, authoritarianism, patriarchy, abetted by clerical power and superiority and rigidity, are like broken cisterns. They no longer sustain life. You know, I visited St. John Lateran recently with a group of pilgrims from my own diocese. And there was one curiosity that caught my attention. And that was, I don't know if you've been to St. John Lateran, but on the floor, on the marble floor of the basilica, there were these very elaborate circular markings. And I subsequently learned that those elaborate circular markings on the floor of the church were meant to assist the Pope and his entourage in liturgical processions. One could imagine how perfectly they were arrayed in their cappa magnas, in their splendid ornate vestments. And I just wondered whether this was the natural progression of the imperial church, which came to be born after the conversion of Constantine, a church that was so much identified, so much synonymous with the arena of power and the enclosure for the privileged, especially the male species. So I wonder whether or not this was the vision of church that we can subscribe to today. Thank God, I think we have moved on since. And the vision of the church of the poor, the church of the Anawim, is being rightfully reclaimed for our time, especially by Pope Francis. Thank God he's moving decisively in that direction, that the church is about relationships, not power. The church is communal, a discipleship of equals rather than anything else. So my third dream for the church is a church that is the true face of God's love and mercy. You know, prior to the Second Vatican Council, the church was very suspicious of the world, which was perceived as evil. The three classic enemies, the world, the flesh, and the devil. It was a very defensive, a kind of a fortress church. However, Gaudium et Spes, that guiding document of the council, presented a new paradigm, a church that is not an enclosure that protects its privileged members. It is a fellow pilgrim with the men and women of our age. It is a church incarnate in the world. And therefore, it is not time for fearful retreat, disengagement, or self-reverential pomp. but of accompaniment and engagement and dialogue. Pope Francis uses a rather unconventional term to describe the church. He famously says that pastors need to wear the scent of the sheep. He also describes the church as a field hospital, the field hospital that treats the wounded after the battle. I quote, "The thing that the church needs most today is the ability to heal wounds, to warm hearts. It needs nearness and proximity." And that is his vision for the church, not a perfect society, not the enclosure for the privileged, but a refuge for the poor, an oasis for the weary, and a hospital for the wounded. The field hospital is not concerned with defending against the threats of encroachment and the loss of its status and privileges. Instead, it goes out of itself to respond to the needs of those whose lives are at risk. It engages with the world rather than withdraws into enclaves, ghettos. Some of you might have heard of the book called The Benedict Option by Rod Dry. The idea lies behind the book is that in the face of a rather ungodly world, this decadent Western civilization, we need to embed ourselves in stable communities of faith, like Noah in the ark, or Benedict in his monastery. However, our desire to be counter-cultural witness should not imprison us, I would contend, should not imprison us in a ghetto. Indeed, as Pope Francis reminds us, we need to be in prisons, hospitals, out on the streets, villages, factories. Because if this is not so, he continues, the church will be an institution of the exclusive that does not say anything to anyone, not even to the church itself. So being merciful is at the very heart of our Catholic identity, not simply a matter of acting with mercy and compassion to those in need without position of power and privilege intact. Rather, it is a radical discipleship of vulnerability and powerlessness in the footsteps of a humble servant of God. It is an existential stance in favor of the weak and the vulnerable in the face of the prevalent business model of success and power. It is about building people and relationships. It has to do with the kingdom mentality rather than the empire mentality. And finally, my friends, my dream for the church to be the church of the baptized and not the church of the ordained only. Pope Francis urges us to be a church where everybody, he says, can feel welcomed and loved and forgiven and encouraged to live according to the gospel. I firmly believe that there can be no future for the living church without this vital sense of ecclesial solidarity and inclusiveness. By that, I mean there must be space for everybody, space for everyone, even in the structures of the church. As we move beyond clericalism, there is a need to reimagine the way power is exercised in the church. And such reimagining, I contend, can only be a source of blessing and enrichment for all. I dream of the church that dares to break new ground with a view to being radically faithful to the inclusive vision of the church. For he has a habit of challenging ingrained stereotyped attitudes, subverting the tyranny of the majority, breaking social taboos, pushing the boundaries of love, and redefining its meaning. You heard it said that you must do this, do that, but I say to you, his interactions with women, tax collectors, and other types of social outcasts was nothing short of being radical, revolutionary, and boundary breaking. It is this vision of love, inclusion, and human flourishing that I believe strongly that ought to guide our pastoral response. And it seems to me that the Pope has more than moved away from the approach of condemnation and judgment. He refocused on the proclamation of God's love for the poor, the vulnerable, and the marginalized. He has firmly placed the pastoral emphasis on the dignity of every person. He has committed the church to the way of engagement and affirmation and compassion, which is at the core of the gospel. The church can only be the conduit of compassion and speak the language of hope to a broken humanity when it truly personifies the powerlessness and stands where Christ once stood, and that is firmly, unambiguously, on the side of the outcast and the most vulnerable. The Synod on the Family was essentially an exercise in ministering or administering the medicine of mercy to the wounded. In the past, the results of synods were sometimes seen to be foregone conclusions. This past synod, however, has seen what I describe as the unleashing of the energy, long locked up beneath the eyes of institutional security, even if it has also caused a fair amount of chaos. But Francis has lived up to that vision of church which dares to break loose from its comfort zone and self-referential mentality. A church attentive to the signs of the times, incarnate grace at work in the world, even among the unorthodox and the marginalized. So friends, in conclusion, the church today in Australia is being reborn in ways beyond the traditional structures. Like the river that has changed its course, we have a choice to make. It is not, I believe, in yearning for or holding onto the known, the familiar, but in having the courage to reimagine the future and to venture into the unknown chaos like the old Exodus. And in doing that, we shall find life. The Paschal rhythm summons us to a discipleship of humility, poverty, vulnerability, of dying and rising in Christ. We must die, I think, to the old ways of being church, steeped in that culture of clerical power, dominance, and privilege. We must abandon the old paradigm of a fortress church which is prone to exclusivity, patriarchy, elitism. We must learn to rise to Christ-like way of humility, inclusivity, compassion, powerlessness. In the end, I believe, I hope that we are on the threshold of renewal and transformation. The Vatican Council has set in motion a new paradigm that cannot be thwarted by fear or paralysis. Because once the genie is out of the bottle, dear friends, it can never be put back in it again. That new paradigm is one that is based on mutuality, not exclusion, love, not fear, service, not clericalism, engagement with the world, not flight or hostility against it. Incarnate grace, not dualism. So may the Holy Spirit accompany us all as we move boldly in the direction of the kingdom. Thank you, everyone.
Vincent, if you just remain here for a moment.
Yep.
Well, you get the standing ovation.